Welcome to Snooze and Stories. Find a comfortable place. Let your body settle, let your shoulders drop, and let the weight of the day begin to lift. Because tonight, we are going somewhere vast, somewhere ancient, somewhere that smells of wind and grass and open sky. Before we begin, if you enjoy these historical stories, please subscribe right now and help this channel to grow. Every subscriber genuinely makes a difference for a new channel like this, and the like button pushes this video to more people who want to hear stories like these. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures whose stories you'd like to hear, leave a comment below. Now, close your eyes if you like. Imagine a land without edges, a place where the horizon stretches in every direction, unbroken by walls or towers or roads, just rolling hills of grass that ripple in the wind like the surface of a slow green sea. The sky above is enormous here, wider than you have ever seen it. Stars at night press down close, as if the heavens themselves are leaning in to listen. In winter, the cold arrives like a living thing, sharp-toothed, patient, absolute. In summer, the sun burns the steppe gold, and the air hums with the sound of horses and distant thunder. This is Mongolia, or rather, this is the world that existed before Mongolia had a name anyone else would remember. Here, in this immensity, people lived and died by rhythms older than any empire. They followed their herds across the land, reading weather in the color of clouds, reading danger in the stillness of animals. They had no cities, no stone temples, no written language to carry their stories forward. What they had instead was memory and fire and the bond between a rider and his horse. And from this world, this hard, beautiful, forgotten world, one man rose. Not gently, not quietly, but with a force so total, so transformative, that the shape of human history was permanently altered by the time he was done. His name at birth was Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. And this, slowly, softly, at whatever pace carries you towards sleep, is his story. To understand Genghis Khan, you must first understand the world that made him. Not the world of palaces and courts and written law, not the world of cathedral cities rising in stone above the plains of Europe, or the gilded halls of the Chinese emperors behind their great walls, or the minarets and libraries of the Islamic caliphates stretching from Spain to Persia. Those worlds had their own rhythms, their own certainties, their own stories already well underway. The world that made Genghis Khan was a different kind of world entirely. It was the steppe. The Eurasian steppe is one of the largest continuous grasslands on the face of the earth. It stretches from the Hungarian plain in the west all the way to the coast of Manchuria in the east, an almost unimaginable sweep of open land, thousands of miles wide, connecting the edges of Europe to the edges of China like a great green corridor running through the heart of the continent. Across this corridor, wind moves without obstacle. Weather travels fast and hard. The land offers no shelter and asks no permission. To live here is to learn very quickly that the earth does not bend to you, you bend to it. And the people who had bent to it, who had shaped their entire existence around its demands, were the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian plateau. By the 12th century, these were not a single unified people, but a loose and endlessly shifting constellation of clans and tribes, each with its own name, its own grazing territory, its own stories of origin, and its own long memory of grievances. There were the Mongols, of course, from whom our story takes its name, but in this era, that name referred to only one cluster of clans among many. Around them lived the Tartars to the east, bitter rivals with a history of violence stretching back generations. The Merkits roamed the forests and river valleys to the northwest. The Naimans held the western steppe, a powerful and sophisticated people with connections to Nestorian Christianity and the literate cultures of Central Asia. The Karaites occupied the central regions, their leaders having adopted Christianity of a kind, their power substantial and their alliances prized. And threading between all of these were dozens of smaller groups, the Oirats, the Ongurats, the Taichiutes, the Gelairs, each navigating a landscape of loyalty and betrayal that shifted with every season. This was not a peaceful world. It was a world structured around conflict, not out of some unique savagery particular to the people of the steppe, but out of a rational and deeply practical logic. In a land where resources were defined by grass and water, and where grass and water moved with the seasons, competition was not an occasional disruption, it was the permanent condition of life. A clan that could not defend its grazing lands would lose them. A family that could not protect its herds would starve. Weakness was not merely unfortunate, it was fatal. And so the tribes raided one another, constantly, cyclically, almost ritually. Horses were taken, women were taken, children were raised as servants or slaves within the raiding clan. Men who resisted were killed, men who surrendered might be absorbed. The boundaries between clans were not drawn on maps, they had no maps, but were written instead in the accumulated violence of seasons past, in the grudges carried by elders, in the alliances sealed by marriage, and in the blood feuds that could smolder for decades before finally igniting. This constant low-level warfare had a deeply corrosive effect on any attempt at unity. Alliances formed and dissolved. A powerful leader might gather several clans beneath his banner, only for those clans to splinter again at his death, each fragment drifting back into its own orbit of suspicion and self-interest. The concept of a united Mongol people, or a united people of the steppe in any broader sense, was not merely absent in the 12th century, it was, for most of the people living there, nearly unimaginable. Loyalty in this world was not given to a nation or an idea, it was given to a person, to a Khan, to a father, to a sworn brother, and even that loyalty had its limits, enforced not by law, but by the calculus of survival. The physical environment shaped everything about the way these people lived. The gur, the round, felt-covered portable dwelling that the outside world would later call a yurt, was the basic unit of nomadic life. Ingeniously designed to be assembled and disassembled in under an hour, it was warm in the brutal Mongolian winter where temperatures could fall to 40 degrees below zero, and cool enough in summer to be bearable. Inside a gur, a family slept, cooked, raised infants, kept their most valued possessions, and performed the small ceremonies of daily life. Offerings to fire spirits, prayers to Tengri the sky god, the careful maintenance of social hierarchy expressed in who sat where and who was served first. Everything was portable. Everything was practical. A family's wealth was measured not in land, land could not be owned in any permanent sense, but in animals. Horses above all, then sheep, goats, cattle, camels. A man with 10,000 horses was a rich man. A man with none was barely a man at all in the eyes of the steppe. The horse was not merely a possession or tool, it was the central fact of nomadic life. Children learned to ride before they could properly walk, sitting in front of their parents, then on small, gentle ponies of their own, and eventually on the tough, shaggy, almost inexhaustible horses of the Mongolian breed. Small by the standards of other parts of the world, but capable of covering enormous distances on minimal feed, surviving on grass alone when necessary, and moving through terrain that would break a heavier European warhorse within days. A Mongolian warrior and his horse were, in a real sense, a single creature. The skills that steppe life demanded, riding at full gallop across broken ground, shooting a bow accurately from horseback, managing a herd across hundreds of miles of open country, these were not skills acquired in training, they were absorbed from birth, inseparable from the daily texture of existence.
This made the people of the steppe formidable in ways that the settled civilizations surrounding them consistently underestimated and would continue to underestimate until it was far too late.
The spiritual life of the Mongols was woven through the fabric of their daily existence in ways that did not separate the sacred from the practical. They followed a tradition scholars would later call Tengrism, a belief system centered on the sky god Tengri, the great blue, eternal heaven that arched above the steppe without limit. Tengri was not a god who could be approached through buildings or priests or written scripture. He was everywhere, in the wind and the weather, in the movement of animals, in the outcomes of battles. To live rightly was to live in alignment with his will. To succeed spectacularly in war, in leadership, in the gathering of power was evidence of his favor. There were also earth spirits, water spirits, the spirits of particular mountains and rivers. There were shamans, men and women of unusual perception, believed to move between the world of the living and the world of spirits, to speak for the dead and interpret the will of unseen forces. A powerful shaman could hold enormous influence over a community, blessing raids before they departed, reading the shoulder blades of sheep to foretell the future, naming children in ways that would shape their destiny. Into this world, fractured, violent, beautiful, cold, a child would be born around the year 1162. His father was a minor chieftain of a Mongol clan called the Borjigin. His mother had been taken by his father in a raid on a rival group, the Ongorats, on the very day of their wedding journey, seized from her first husband's family by force, as was not uncommon in this world. She was strong, she was resourceful, she would need to be. The child came into the world, it was said, clutching a blood clot in his fist, a dark and striking sign that the shamans read carefully. In the tradition of his people, this was an omen, a mark of destiny. A child born gripping something that looked like dried blood was a child born for war. They named him Temujin, a name derived most likely from a Tartar chieftain his father had recently defeated. In the customs of the steppe, naming a son after a conquered enemy was a way of claiming that victory, carrying it forward, binding the power of the defeated to the bloodline of the victor. He was born into a world that had, for centuries, consumed men like kindling. He would be the one, in the end, to set it alight. His father's name was Yasuge. He was not a great Khan. He was not a ruler of vast territories or a commander of armies that shook the ground beneath their hooves. He was something more modest than that, and in the world of the Mongolian steppe, something more fragile. He was a clan chief of middling power, respected within his own circle, capable of violence when violence was required, bound by the same webs of alliance and obligation that constrained every man who hoped to hold followers together in that unforgiving landscape. But Yasuge had something, a quality that his contemporaries recognized, even if they could not always name it. He carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who believed the world could be bent, at least a little, in the direction of his will. He was a fighter. He was a schemer in the pragmatic way that steppe life demanded, and he was, by the customs of his people, a man who took what he needed when the opportunity arose. It was in this spirit that he had acquired his wife. Her name was Hoalun, and she had not come to Yasuge willingly. She had been traveling with her young husband, a merchant man named Chiladu, when Yasuge and his brothers spotted them on the open steppe. What followed was swift and brutal and entirely unremarkable by the standards of the time. Yasuge gave chase, Chiladu fled to save his life, and Hoalun was taken. She wept, it is said. She pressed her husband's shirt to her face to breathe in his scent one last time as he rode away into the distance. She called out to him, and then she composed herself, because she understood with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman raised in this world that survival now depended on adaptation, and adaptation required a stillness of heart that grief could not afford. She would become one of the most remarkable women in the story we are telling, not because history handed her comfort or safety, but because it handed her almost nothing, and she made from that almost nothing something extraordinary. But that is slightly ahead of us.
For now, she was Yasuge's wife, and in the year that historians estimate as approximately 1162, the sources are not precise, and scholars have debated the date for generations, she gave birth to their first son on the banks of the Onon River in the northeastern corner of what is now Mongolia. The baby came into the world, the legend tells us, with a blood clot clutched in his right hand. Dark and dense as a stone, it sat in his tiny fist, like a seal, like a signature. The shamans were consulted. The omens were read. This was not a common birth. This child had arrived already gripping something, already, in some symbolic sense, refusing to come into the world empty-handed.
Yasuge named his son Temujin. The name had a story behind it, as names in this world always did. Just days before the birth, Yasuge had returned from a raid in which he had captured a Tatar chieftain, a man of some standing among the enemy clans, whose name was Temujin Uge. It was a Mongol and Turkic tradition to name a newborn son after a recently defeated enemy, a practice layered with meaning. It was an act of symbolic conquest, the enemy's name absorbed into the victor's bloodline, his identity dissolved and reborn in service to the family that had overcome him. It was also perhaps a way of carrying forward the energy of victory, of marking a child with the flavor of triumph from his very first breath. So the boy was named Temujin, and in the years that followed, he grew up in the way that all children of the steppe grew up, which is to say, close to the ground, close to animals, close to danger, and saturated from infancy in the skills and knowledge that this world demanded of its people. He would have learned to ride almost before he could remember not knowing how. The Mongolian steppe horse is a peculiar and wonderful creature, short-legged and barrel-chested, with a thick mane and a constitution that seems almost impervious to hardship. These horses were not groomed or pampered. They were not kept in stables. They lived outside through the worst winters, pawing through snow to reach the frozen grass beneath, and they emerged in spring, thinner but alive, ready to run again. To ride one was to participate in a kind of partnership between human and animal that was less about mastery and more about mutual understanding. Temujin would have been placed on horseback as a very young child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, seated in front of his father or an older kinsman, feeling the rhythm of the animal beneath him before his legs were long enough to grip its sides. By 6 or 7, he would have ridden alone. By 10, he would have been expected to ride hard and ride long without complaint. He would also have learned the bow. The Mongolian composite bow was and remains one of the most extraordinary weapons ever devised by human ingenuity. Constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, each layer contributing a different quality to the whole, it was compact enough to be used from horseback, yet powerful enough to drive an arrow through armor at distances that astonished enemies who had never faced it. It took years to make and years to master. Children began with small practice bows, developing the specific muscles required, not just the arms, but the back, the shoulders, the core, over years of daily use. By adulthood, a skilled Mongolian archer could loose 10 or 12 arrows a minute from a galloping horse, each one aimed, each one deadly. These were the tools of survival, and Temujin grew into them as naturally as he grew into his own skin. But childhood on the steppe was not only combat and hardship. There were also the long, still days of summer, when the grass was high and the herds were fat, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that made the world feel, briefly, like a place of abundance rather than scarcity. There were the evenings inside the gur when the fire burned low and the adults told stories. Stories of great warriors and clever spirits, of ancestors who had ridden to the edge of the world and returned with its secrets, of Tengri, the eternal sky, who watched over those who were strong and brave and loyal.
Temujin grew up with brothers. Hasar was one, fierce, loyal, and archer of exceptional talent who would stand beside his brother through decades of war. Hachun and Temuge were younger, and there was also Bekter, a half-brother from one of Yasuge's other wives, whose presence in the family would later become the subject of one of the most troubling episodes of Temujin's early life. There was also a sister, Temulan. And then there was Yasuge himself, at the center of the family's world, imperfect, practical, occasionally brutal, but present. A father in a world where a father's presence meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yasuge made a decision that was entirely conventional for a man of his standing, and which would shape the entire arc of his son's life in ways neither of them could have anticipated. It was time to find the boy a wife. Or rather, it was time to find the boy a betrothed. Marriage on the steppe was arranged early, the bonds sealed in childhood to create alliances between families, to weave the social fabric tighter, to give children time to grow into the partnerships their parents had negotiated on their behalf. The actual marriage would come later, when both parties were older. For now, what mattered was the agreement, the exchange, the promise. Yasuge took his young son and rode west toward the territory of the Ongorats, the very same people from whom he had, years earlier, taken Hoyalin. The Ongorats were known among the tribes for the beauty of their daughters and the wisdom of marrying those daughters to powerful men. It was, in its way, their strategy for survival, forging bonds through marriage rather than through warfare, building a network of relationships that gave them protection without requiring them to be the strongest fighters on the steppe. On the road, they encountered a man named Dai Sechin, a name that translates roughly as the wise. He was an Ongorat elder, perceptive and practical, and he had a daughter. Her name was Berta. The meeting between the families is described in The Secret History of the Mongols, the great chronicle of Temujin's life written decades after his death, the closest thing we have to a primary source for this period, with a vividness that suggests the storytellers considered it a pivotal moment. Dai Sechin looked at the boy Temujin and saw something in him. Something in his eyes, the chronicle says, a brightness, a steadiness, a quality of presence that distinguished him, even at 9 years old, from ordinary children. He spoke to Yasuge plainly. He said that he had dreamed of a white gerfalcon carrying the sun and moon in its talons, and that when he looked at this boy, he felt the dream had arrived in flesh.
Whether or not Dai Sechin truly dreamed such a dream, whether this is history or poetry or the retrospective legend-making of people who knew how the story ended, the practical outcome was real. An agreement was reached. Temujin would stay with Dai Sechin's family for a period of time, as was customary, to learn the family's ways and allow the children to become acquainted. He and Berta would be betrothed. When the time was right, they would be married. Yasuge rode home alone, leaving his 9-year-old son in the household of strangers. It was, in every way, a normal thing to do in this world. Children were placed in other households regularly, as pledges of alliance, as apprentices in the ways of a different clan, as part of the slow weaving together of families that kept the social order of the steppe from flying apart entirely. But on the road home, something happened that would shatter the normalcy of everything. Yasuge stopped to rest among a group of Tatars who were holding a feast. To refuse hospitality on the steppe was an insult. To accept it was the most basic social obligation. He dismounted. He ate and drank among them. And the Tatars, who had not forgotten the raids of years past, who carried their own long memories of blood and grievance, poisoned him. It was not immediate. The poison, whatever form it took, worked slowly. Yasuge rode on, but by the time he reached home, he was already dying. He called for his son. Messengers were sent to Dai Sechin's household, but the distance was too great and the dying too fast. Yasuge died before Temujin could return. The boy who had been sent away as the son of a clan chief came back to find himself something else entirely. Fatherless, in a world that had very little patience for fatherless boys. He was 9 years old. The storm had not yet begun, but the sky on every horizon had turned the color of iron.
Grief on the Mongolian steppe was not a luxury you could afford for long. Temujin returned from Dai Sechin's household to find his family diminished in an instant.
not just by the loss of a father, but by everything a father's presence had held together. Yasuge had been the gravitational center of their small world. He had been the reason other men followed, the reason the clan had cohesion, the reason there was meat in the gare and horses in the herd, and a measure of safety in an unsafe landscape. Without him, all of that began to come apart almost immediately. The clan that Yasuge had led, the Borjigan Mongols, did not wait long before making their intentions clear. In the world of the steppe, loyalty followed strength. It was not cruel or unusual for a clan to reassess its allegiances when its leader died. It was simply the logic of survival operating without sentiment. A widow with young children and no powerful male protector was not an asset to a clan trying to hold its position in a dangerous landscape. She was a liability. The animals she held, the grazing rights her husband had claimed, these things could be redistributed to families who could actually defend them. And so the clan elders made their decision. They abandoned Holen and her children. They packed their gares, gathered their herds, and moved on, leaving behind the widow and her 5 children on the banks of the Onan River with almost nothing. No animals of any significance, no warriors to protect them, no men at all, except for the boys, and the oldest among them, Temujin, was 9 years old. What happened next is one of the most remarkable passages in the secret history of the Mongols, and one of the passages that feels most vividly, most humanly true. Holen did not collapse. She pulled up her skirts, it is written, and ran along the river. She dug up roots and wild onions and gathered berries and whatever the land could offer. She fed her children on bird cherries and crab apples, on garlic and leeks pulled from the riverbanks, on anything edible that could be found, caught, or foraged from the unforgiving landscape around them. She showed her children how to fish. She showed them how to set small traps. She kept them alive by the force of her will and the tireless movement of her hands, day after day, through seasons that were merciless and seasons that were merely hard. This period of abandonment and near starvation lasted for years, not weeks, not months, years. And it left marks on Temujin that no amount of later glory would entirely erase. He learned in those years beside the Onan River what it felt like to be discarded, what it meant to be considered worthless by people who had once called you kin, what hunger tasted like, not the hunger of a missed meal, but the deep, patient, humiliating hunger of genuine deprivation. He learned that the world's compassion had a floor, and that floor was very low. He also learned something else, something harder to name, but perhaps more important than any of it.
He learned that survival was a choice. Not always, not in the face of every force that the world could throw at a person, but in the spaces where choice still existed, where the difference between living and dying came down to will and ingenuity, and the refusal to accept the verdict that circumstances seemed to be delivering. His mother had modeled that refusal for him every single day. He absorbed it the way he had absorbed riding and archery, not as a lesson, but as a way of being. But survival under pressure does not always produce nobility. There came a day, Temujin was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, when the tensions within the small, desperate family group found a terrible outlet. The half-brother Bekter had become a source of friction. The secret history is not entirely clear on the specifics, but the outline is this. Bekter, older than Temujin and Khazar, was asserting a kind of dominance within the family, taking food, taking small game that the younger boys had caught, exercising the prerogatives of seniority in ways that felt, in the context of near starvation, like something close to theft. There may also have been a deeper tension, a question of who would one day lead what remained of the family, who would inherit whatever thin claim to status the Borjigan name still carried. Whatever the precise cause, Temujin and his brother Khazar made a decision that was as cold as it was final. They hunted Bekter down on the open steppe.
They approached him from two directions, arrows already nocked. Bekter, seeing what was coming, did not run. He sat down. He looked at his brothers and told them not to harm Belgute, the other half-brother, who was not part of this. And then he sat and waited. They killed him. Temujin was perhaps 11 years old. It is a moment that historians and biographers have wrestled with ever since. Some see in it the cold ruthlessness that would define Genghis Khan's later career, the willingness to eliminate a threat with complete decisiveness, without hesitation, without the paralysis of sentiment. Others see something more complicated, a desperate act by a starving, traumatized child trying to hold together the only thing he had left in the world, the thin thread of family unity under conditions of extreme duress. Their mother Hoylin was furious. She berated her sons with the anger of a woman who understood, perhaps better than they did, what it cost a family to turn on itself. She compared them to hunting dogs eating their own litter. She was not wrong, and yet the act revealed something about the boy Temujin that the steppe itself seemed to confirm. He would do what was necessary. He would not flinch from the hardest decisions. The capacity for that kind of cold clarity in a world that punished hesitation was not entirely without value. It was around this same period that the Taichute clan, relatives of the Borjigin, one of the groups that had abandoned Hoylin and her children, decided that the growing boy represented a threat worth eliminating before he became too large to manage.
They came with warriors. They raided the small family camp on the Onan. Temujin escaped into the forest and hid for days among the trees, moving carefully, trying to wait out his pursuers. But eventually hunger and the impossibility of remaining hidden indefinitely drove him out, and he was captured. What happened next was humiliating in the precise and deliberate way that the steppe used humiliation as a tool of control. The Taichiots brought Temujin in a kang. A kang was a wooden restraint, a heavy yoke fitted around the neck and wrists, forcing the wearer's arms out and up, preventing sleep, preventing the most basic acts of self-care, making every movement an exercise in discomfort. It was used for prisoners considered too dangerous to simply tie up and too potentially useful to kill outright. It was a statement about a person's status. You are nothing, it said. You are less than an animal, because an animal at least moves freely. Temujin wore that kang among the Taichiots as a kind of slave, passed from ger to ger, fed when they felt like feeding him, displayed as a symbol of their power over what remained of Yasuge's line. He endured it. He observed everything. He learned the rhythms of his captors, who was kind, who was cruel, who was careless, who might be moved to help him. And he found that person. During the midsummer festival of the Taichiot camp, a night of celebration when guards were fewer and attention was scattered, a family who had shown him small kindnesses provided the opening he needed. A young man helped him, some accounts say, or perhaps simply looked the other way at the right moment. Temujin moved. He fled into the Onan River, lying in the shallows with only his face above the water, hiding in the cold current while his pursuers searched the banks around him. A man named Sorkhan Shira of the Suldus clan found him there. He looked at the boy shivering in the river, wearing his kang, hiding in the dark, and he made a choice. He sent the other searchers in a different direction. Later that night, he helped Temujin remove the kang. He hid him in a cart of wool for days, fed him, and when it was safe, sent him on his way with a horse, a bow, and enough food to travel. It was an extraordinary act of generosity and courage in a world where helping an escaped prisoner could bring severe punishment down on a family. Temujin did not forget it. He never forgot acts of loyalty, the same way he never forgot acts of betrayal. Both categories were filed away with equal precision in a memory that turned out to be, among his many formidable qualities, almost perfect. He found his family again on the banks of the Onan. They had survived his absence. Hoelin had kept them alive, as she always did.
He was somewhere between 13 and 15 years old. He had been abandoned by his clan, had killed his half-brother, had been enslaved and humiliated, had hidden in a freezing river, and had escaped by learning to read the weaknesses of people who thought they had power over him. He had nothing. No herd of any size, no warriors sworn to his name, no allies of significance, no inheritance except a name, Borjigan, the blue-eyed ones, a clan scattered and diminished, and a mother who had refused against every reasonable expectation to let her children disappear into the steppes' indifference. But something had been forged in those years that could not be taken away. A certain kind of man emerges from prolonged suffering, not broken, but clarified. The experience burns away everything soft and leaves behind a hard, clear understanding of what the world is and what it requires. Not bitterness, or not only bitterness, but knowledge. Practical, unsentimental, deeply personal knowledge of how power works, how loyalty is earned and lost, how quickly the people around you will abandon you when you are no longer useful, and what it costs to become someone that the world cannot so easily discard. Temujin had paid for that knowledge in full. Now, slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who had learned that survival was measured in seasons rather than days, he began to build.
The first thing Temujin did when he had enough stability to act was honor the promise his father had made. He went to find Berta. She was still with her family, with Day Sechin, the wise, who had looked at a 9-year-old boy on the open steppe and seen something worth binding his daughter to. The years had passed. The boy had survived things that would have ended most men before they had the chance to become men at all. And now he arrived at Day Sechin's ger, older, leaner, carrying the particular stillness of someone who has learned to move carefully through a world that has already tried to destroy him, and he asked for what had been promised. Day Sechin gave his daughter willingly. Perhaps he had kept faith because he was an honorable man. Perhaps because the dream of the gyrfalcon still meant something to him. Perhaps, with the pragmatic wisdom his name implied, he had watched the years unfold and concluded that his instinct about this young man had not been wrong. Berta came with a gift, a magnificent sable fur coat, dark and lustrous, the kind of thing that carried real value in the economy of the steppe. It was her dowry, in a sense, a portable expression of wealth, and Temujin, with the instincts of a man who already understood that building power required building relationships, knew exactly what to do with it. He did not keep it. He rode with it to find a man named Togrul. Togrul was the Han of the Karaites, one of the most powerful leaders on the central steppe, a man of considerable sophistication who had adopted a form of Nestorian Christianity, maintained relationships with the settled world to the south, and commanded warriors in numbers that dwarfed anything Temujin could yet dream of assembling. He was also, crucially, a man who had once been an ally and friend of Yasuge. In the customs of the steppe, that relationship did not simply die with Yasuge. It could be renewed, renegotiated, reactivated, if the right gesture was made in the right spirit. Temujin presented Togrul with the sable coat and invoked his father's name. It was a masterful move for a young man with almost nothing. He was not asking for charity. He was not presenting himself as a supplicant. He was presenting himself as a son honoring his father's bonds, as a man who understood the language of obligation and alliance, as someone worth knowing. The coat was beautiful. The gesture was even more so. Togrul accepted. He called Temujin his son. He promised support. The relationship with Togrul would prove to be one of the central pillars of Temujin's rise, and later, one of the most painful of his betrayals. But that was still far ahead. For now, it gave the young man something precious and rare, the backing of a powerful protector, a name he could invoke, a shadow he could stand in while he began, carefully and methodically, to build something of his own. Around this same period, Temujin formed another bond that would shape the next decade of his life in ways both glorious and devastating.
His name was Jamuka. They had known each other as children. There are accounts of games played together on the frozen Onan, of small gifts exchanged, of the kind of intense boyhood friendship that the steppe formalized in the institution of the Anda, the sworn brother. To become Anda with someone was not a casual arrangement, it was a bond that the culture treated as equal to, or in some ways deeper than, the bonds of blood. You shared everything with your Anda, you fought beside him, you did not betray him. Temujin and Yamuka renewed that bond as young men, in a ceremony that involved the exchange of gifts, knucklebones, arrows, and a formal declaration of brotherhood. They camped together, shared a blanket, spent a year and more in each other's constant company, raiding together, talking together, building the small but growing network of followers that each was accumulating. They were, in many ways, similar men. Both were ambitious, both were intelligent in the specific, practical, improvisational way that the steppe demanded. Both understood power, where it came from, how it moved, what it cost to acquire, and what it cost to lose. But they were also, in crucial ways, profoundly different. Jamuka was a man of tradition. He believed in the existing hierarchies of steppe society, in the aristocracy of bloodline, in the idea that certain families were born to lead and others to follow. He was charming and magnetic and capable of inspiring fierce loyalty, but his vision of a better steppe was fundamentally a conservative one. The old order, maintained more firmly, led more competently. Temujin was something else, something that perhaps neither he nor anyone around him yet fully understood. He did not believe, or did not act as though he believed, that birth determined destiny. The men who followed him found that loyalty and courage were rewarded regardless of where a man came from. He promoted on merit. He shared plunder equitably. He remembered names, remembered services rendered, remembered debts of gratitude with the same exactness he remembered debts of grievance. This difference would eventually make them irreconcilable, but that time had not yet come. What came first was catastrophe. In the deep of a winter night, the Merkits arrived. The Merkits, the tribe from whom Yasuge had all those years ago stolen Hoelin, had not forgotten. The steppe had a long memory, and the Merkits carried their grievance like a stone in the chest, passed from father to son, waiting for the moment when it could be discharged. Now they came, with warriors enough to overwhelm the small camp where Temujin and Berthe were living, and they took what they had come for. They took Berthe. Temujin escaped. The accounts say he fled into the forest of Borkhan Haldun, the sacred mountain, with a handful of companions, while the Merkits ransacked the camp. His mother, Hoelin, was also taken, briefly, before being released, but Berthe was kept. She was given to a Merkit man as a wife, the same symbolic logic that had originally brought Hoelin into Yasuge's possession, now reversed in a cycle of retribution that the steppe seemed to generate endlessly, like weather. The months that followed were among the most agonizing of Temujin's young life. He had built something, small, fragile, but real. He had a wife, he had allies, he had the beginning of a future, and it had been taken from him in a single night by men who were acting, from their own perspective, with complete justification. He went to his two most powerful allies. He went to Togrul and he went to Jamuka. He appealed to them with the directness and emotional force that would become one of his defining qualities as a leader. He did not dissemble, did not play the politics of understatement. He said, "They have taken my wife. Help me get her back." They came. The combined force of Togrul's Karates, Jamuka's followers, and Temujin's own warriors descended on the Merkit camps along the Selenga River. The attack was swift and overwhelming. The Merkits scattered. Their camps were destroyed, their families captured, their herds driven off in the manner of all steppe raids conducted at scale. And Temujin found Borta. She was running toward him in the dark and confusion of the raid, or so the secret history describes it, the two of them finding each other in the noise and fire, grasping hold of one another on the open steppe while the battle dissolved around them. It is one of the few moments in the chronicle that feels genuinely tender. Whatever Temujin was, and he was many things, not all of them gentle, his feeling for Borta appears to have been real and lasting in a way that his relationships with other women never quite replicated. There was, however, a complication. Borta was pregnant. The child she carried, a son who would be named Jochi, was born in circumstances that made his paternity permanently uncertain. Had he been conceived before the raid and was therefore Temujin's son, or had he been conceived during the months of captivity, making his father a merchant? The question was never definitively answered, not by Temujin, not by Borta, not by the secret history. Temujin claimed Jochi as his own. He raised him as his own. He never, in any recorded statement, publicly repudiated him. But the uncertainty lingered like smoke. It would resurface decades later in painful ways, creating fractures in the family that even the greatest conqueror in history could not fully repair. For now, though, Borta was home. The merchants had been punished, and Temujin's reputation as a man who could call on powerful allies, who could strike decisively, who rewarded loyalty and avenged wrongs, had grown considerably. Men began to come to him. Not a flood, not yet, but a steady trickle of warriors, families, younger sons of minor clans looking for a leader worth following, men who had heard the stories and decided to attach their fortunes to this rising figure on the northeastern steppe. Temujin received each one. He learned their names. He found out what they were good at. He gave them tasks that matched their abilities and watched how they performed. The growing of an army on the steppe was not, in this era, purely a military operation. It was a social one. A man who wanted followers had to be a man worth following, not just in battle, where courage was common enough, but in the quieter negotiations of daily life. How did he settle disputes? How did he distribute meat after a hunt? How did he treat the families of the men who served him? How did he respond when one of his people was wronged by an outsider? Temujin, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at all of this. But the relationship with Jamuka was fraying. The two sworn brothers had remained close through the rescue of Borta and the campaigns that followed, but tensions were growing beneath the surface. Small frictions, questions of precedence, the increasingly obvious fact that the two men attracted different kinds of followers and embodied different visions of what power on the steppe should look like. Jamuka's people were the traditional aristocracy. Temujin's were, increasingly, the meritocracy, men who had risen not by birth but by ability, who owed their position entirely to him. The break came, however, as breaks on the steppe often did, without full explanation. One morning, after a period of shared camp, Jamuka said something. The secret history records his words, but their meaning has been debated for centuries, and Hoylan and Borta, who both of whom seem to have had sharper political instincts than almost anyone around them, read it as a signal. It was time to separate. Temujin's camp broke and moved in the night, and by morning the Onda were no longer sharing a fire. They would meet again on the battlefield. But first, Temujin had an identity to claim. The men who followed him needed a name to follow. The clans that were beginning to gather around his banner needed to know what they were gathering toward. He was no longer simply the fatherless son of a minor chief. He was something new, something the steppe had not quite seen before. He was becoming, slowly and then all at once, a Khan.
The steppe does not crown its kings with ceremony and silk. It tests them. It breaks them against each other like stones. And the one that does not shatter becomes, by that simple and brutal logic, the one that endures. What followed the parting of Temujin and Jamuka was not a clean or sudden war. It was something longer and more complicated. A decade and more of shifting alliances, crushing defeats, improbable recoveries, and the slow, grinding accumulation of power by a man who seemed, again and again, to understand something about the nature of loyalty that his rivals could not quite grasp. The first great test came sooner than Temujin might have wished. Not long after the split, a gathering of clans proclaimed Jamuka their Gur Khan, a title meaning universal ruler, a declaration of intent that was also a declaration of rivalry. The message was clear. There were now two poles on the Mongolian steppe, two men around whom power was organizing itself, and the space between them was not large enough for both. The battle that followed, at a place called Dalan Baljut, went to Jamuka.
Temujin was defeated. His forces were scattered. And Jamuka, in the aftermath, did something that the secret history records with a kind of horrified precision. He boiled the captured leaders of enemy clans alive in great cauldrons, a spectacular act of cruelty that was also, in its way, a political statement. This is what opposition costs. This is the price of choosing the wrong side. The effect was not entirely what Jamuka intended. Cruelty on that scale, displayed that openly, has a way of clarifying minds. Some men who had been considering their options now made them. They did not all go to Jamuka. Many came to Temujin, drawn not by the promise of safety, which Temujin could not yet guarantee, but by something harder to name. A sense, perhaps, that the man on the Onon River was building towards something different, something that did not require the theatrical destruction of enemies to hold itself together. Temujin absorbed the defeat. He did not collapse under it, did not spiral into recrimination or despair. He learned from it, rebuilt, and waited for the landscape to shift again. It shifted in the form of the Tatars. The Tatars were, in many ways, the defining enemy of Temujin's early life. They had poisoned his father. They had been the source of the name he carried, a name taken from a Tatar prisoner to mark a victory over them. And they were, in the early 1190s, in serious trouble with the Jin dynasty of northern China, the great settled civilization to the south that watched the steppe with permanent anxiety and periodic military intervention. The Jin wanted the Tatars punished. They sent a request, or perhaps a command dressed as a request, to Togrul of the Karaites, asking for assistance in a campaign against the Tatar tribes. Togrul brought Temujin, and together, in a series of campaigns in the early 1190s, they helped the Jin forces devastate the Tatar Confederacy. For Temujin, this was not merely a military operation, it was personal. He pursued the Tatars with a ferocity that went beyond the tactical. He was settling a debt that had been accumulating since the day his father came home dying from a Tatar feast. The Tatars were broken, their leaders killed, their people scattered and absorbed into the growing Mongol Confederation.
The Jin, in recognition of services rendered, awarded titles to both Togrul and Temujin. Togrul received a prestigious designation. Temujin received a lesser one, commander of border troops, something of that order. But he received it, and titles from the Jin carried weight. They marked a man as legitimate in the eyes of the most powerful settled state in the region. For a steppe chieftain still in the process of establishing himself, that was not nothing. The campaigns against the Tatars also produced one of the clearest early glimpses of Temujin's emerging genius as a military and political organizer. After the victory, he issued an order that was, by the standards of the steppe, revolutionary. The spoils were not to be seized randomly by individual warriors, as tradition dictated. They were to be collected centrally and distributed according to a set of rules, a proto-system of organized plunder that rewarded contribution and maintained order in the aftermath of violence. Warriors who violated this order were punished. Leaders who enforced it were rewarded. This was not how things had been done, but it was unmistakably more effective than how things had been done, and effectiveness, in the long run, has a way of becoming tradition. Through the 1190s and into the first years of the new century, the wars continued. Against the Taichiutes, the clan that had enslaved Temujin in his boyhood, now brought to account with the particular satisfaction of a man who has waited patiently for justice to become possible. Against various Merkit remnants who continued to resist and harry, against smaller clans that tested the edges of Temujin's growing power and found those edges harder than expected. And always in the background, the unresolved question of Jamuha. The two former sworn brothers circled each other across the years like two weather systems building toward collision. There were moments of uneasy cooperation. The steppe's politics required flexibility, and even enemies could find common cause against a third party when the situation demanded it. But the underlying tension never resolved. It deepened. The collision came in stages. First, there was the Battle of Kalakalgid Sands in 1203, a catastrophic defeat for Temujin, one of the worst of his career.
delivered in part by the betrayal of people he had considered allies. Togrul's son Sengam had long been suspicious of Temujin's growing power, resentful of the closeness between his father and this upstart Mongol chieftain. He worked on his father, whispering doubts, stoking fears, until Togrul, old, uncertain, susceptible to the anxieties of a man who had held power long enough to understand how easily it could be lost, began to pull away. The result was an ambush. Temujin walked into a trap laid partly by his sworn protector, the man he had called father, the man to whom he had presented a sable coat as a young man with nothing but ambition and a good instinct for gesture. The battle that followed was brutal and nearly fatal. Temujin escaped, but barely. Several of his closest companions were wounded. The army he had spent years building was scattered. He retreated to the region of Baljuna Lake, a muddy, unpromising body of water in the northeastern steppe, and there, in conditions of genuine privation, he gathered the men who had stayed with him. They were not many, but they were, it turned out, exactly the right men. The ones who remained after a catastrophic defeat were the ones that were there not for convenience or calculation, but for something deeper, for him. The oath taken at Baljuna Lake, sometimes called the Baljuna Covenant, became one of the foundational legends of the Mongol Empire. Temujin and his surviving companions, perhaps 19 men in total, drank the muddy water of the lake together and swore an oath of mutual loyalty. If he rose again, they would share in everything. If he fell, they would fall together. Among those men were peoples of different tribes, different religions, different backgrounds, a detail that would later take on enormous significance as Temujin built a system that depended not on ethnic or religious uniformity, but on personal loyalty and demonstrated competence.
He rose again. Within a year, he had rebuilt his forces with a speed that stunned his enemies. He moved against Togrul and the Karates, the man who had betrayed him, with a devastating campaign that broke the Karate Confederation in a matter of months. Togrul fled. He was killed, in the end, by Naimans who did not recognize him, a lonely, undignified death for a man who had once been the most powerful Khan on the central steppe. Then came the Naimans. The Naimans were the last great power on the western steppe. Sophisticated, literate in a way that most Mongol clans were not, they had a script, administrators, connections to the wider world of Central Asian trade and culture. Their leader, Tayang Khan, had watched Temujin's rise with increasing alarm, and in 1204 he made the decision to move against him before it was too late. It was already too late. The campaign against the Naimans in 1204 was one of the most complete military victories of Temujin's career to that point. His army moved with a coordination and speed that the Naimans, despite their sophistication, could not match. Tayang Khan was defeated and killed. His son Kuchlug escaped west to cause trouble later in Central Asia, but the Naiman Confederacy was broken. And with the Naimans broken, Jamukha was finally, truly alone. He had spent the years of Temujin's struggles attaching himself to one coalition after another, always opposing his old sworn brother, always finding himself on the losing side as Temujin's forces absorbed and outlasted each challenge. Now his last allies were gone. His followers, one by one, had made the calculation that was increasingly obvious to everyone on the steppe. This was not a rivalry with two possible outcomes anymore. There was only one man left. Jamukha's own men betrayed him. They brought him, bound, to Temujin, expecting, perhaps, a reward. Temujin had the men executed instead. You did not reward people who betrayed their own leaders. That was a principle he held with absolute consistency, regardless of whether the betrayal happened to benefit him. A man who would betray one master would betray another. Then he faced Jamukha. What passed between them in that final meeting? The two boys who had played on the frozen Onan, who had sworn brotherhood, who had spent 15 years trying to destroy each other, is recorded in the secret history with a spare and almost unbearable intimacy.
Temujin offered him his life. He asked Jamuka to return to him, to be his sworn brother again, to stand beside him as the steppe was remade. Jamuka refused. He said, with a dignity that is hard not to admire even across 8 centuries, that there was not room in the sky for 2 suns. He asked only for a death without the shedding of blood, the honorable death that the steppe granted to men of noble birth. Temujin granted it. Jamuka was executed. The manner of it, exactly how a man is killed without blood being shed, has been debated. Broken neck, perhaps, burial alive. The sources are not precise, but the result was the same. The last serious rival was gone.
And in the spring of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, the same river where Temujin had been born, where he had hidden from his captors, where he had spent years rebuilding from nothing, a great gathering was called. It was the Kurultai, the grand assembly of all the Mongol and allied tribes. They came from across the steppe, every clan that had submitted, every leader who now acknowledged a single authority over the vast grasslands that had for centuries refused to acknowledge any authority at all. A great white banner was raised. 9 tails of white horsehair, the symbol of sovereignty on the steppe, caught the spring wind above the assembly, and the assembled leaders proclaimed Temujin something that had never quite existed before. They called him Genghis Khan. The meaning of the title is still debated by scholars. Ocean ruler, perhaps, universal ruler, fierce ruler. The exact etymology twists through layers of Mongolian and Turkic linguistic history and resists simple translation, but the meaning and practice was unmistakable. He was the Khan of Khans, the ruler not of a tribe or a clan or even a confederation, but of a people, a new people, forged from the dozens of fractious, feuding, endlessly fragmented tribes of the Mongolian plateau into something that had never existed before. Something that would, in the decades to come, become the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. He was 44 years old, approximately. He had spent his entire life, from the moment his father was poisoned and his clan walked away, preparing for this, though he could not have known it. Every humiliation, every defeat, every night hiding in a river or chained in a kang or camped by a muddy lake with 19 loyal men had been, in some sense, a preparation, not by design, but by consequence, by the way that extreme pressure applied to the right material produces not destruction, but transformation. The boy called Temujin was gone. Genghis Khan looked out over the assembled tribes at the white banner snapping in the spring wind above the Onon River and began to think about what came next. The steppe was his. Now he turned his eyes outward.
Before the armies moved, Genghis Khan built something, not in stone, not in the way that settled civilizations built, with walls and towers and monuments designed to outlast the men who commissioned them. What he built was invisible, in the way that the most durable things often are. He built a system, a set of rules and structures and principles that would hold together an empire spanning thousands of miles, governing people of dozens of languages and faiths and customs, maintaining order across distances that would have made any previous administrative system simply collapse under its own weight. The centerpiece of this system was the Yasa. The word itself, sometimes written jasag, sometimes Yasa, means roughly law or decree. But to call the Yasa simply a legal code is to undersell it in the same way that calling the steppe simply a field undersells the landscape we have been describing. The Yasa was not a written constitution in the modern sense. It was a living body of rulings, precedents, and decrees that Genghis Khan issued over the course of his reign, administered by his people, enforced with absolute consistency, and understood by everyone within the empire as the foundational rules of the new world he was constructing.
We do not have the Yasa in its complete original form. No single document survives. What we have are fragments, descriptions recorded by later historians, references in chronicles, the accounts of travelers and administrators who observed the Mongol system in operation and wrote down what they saw with varying degrees of accuracy and comprehension. From these fragments, scholars have assembled a picture that is incomplete but nevertheless striking. The Yasa addressed an enormous range of human behavior. It regulated warfare, how prisoners were to be treated, when quarter could be given and when it could not, how plunder was to be divided, what constituted loyalty and what constituted treason. It regulated commerce, the conditions under which merchants could travel safely through Mongol territory, the obligations of protection that the empire owed to those who operated under its sanction. And it regulated daily life, prohibitions against theft, against quarreling in ways that disrupted the community, against the pollution of water sources, which, in a nomadic culture dependent on clean rivers and springs, was not merely an environmental concern, but a matter of survival. And it established, with a clarity that was remarkable for its time and place, a principle that would define the entire character of Mongol rule. Merit, not birth, determined position. This was not a small thing. In the world of the 12th and 13th centuries, in the feudal hierarchies of Europe, in the aristocratic structures of the Islamic caliphates, in the dynastic rigidity of the Chinese imperial system, birth was destiny. A man born to a noble family inherited noble position. A man born to a peasant family died a peasant, barring extraordinary circumstances. The idea that talent and loyalty and demonstrated competence could elevate a man regardless of his origins was not unknown in theory, but it was rarely practiced with the consistency that Genghis Khan applied to it.
He had personal reasons for this principle. He had been himself a man with nothing, abandoned, enslaved, forced to build everything from the ground up without the protection of a powerful name or a wealthy clan. The men who had stayed with him at Baljuna Lake, who had fought beside him through decades of steppe warfare, came from every conceivable background. Some were nobles, many were not. What they shared was not lineage, but loyalty, not ancestry, but ability. He rewarded them accordingly. His generals, the great commanders who would go on to lead Mongol armies across Asia and into Europe, were not all men of aristocratic birth. Subutai, arguably the most brilliant military mind in the entire history of the Mongol conquests, was the son of a blacksmith. Jebe, another of the great commanders, had first come to Temujin's attention by shooting his horse out from under him in battle, and had been so impressed by the young warrior's honesty in admitting the act that he had made him a commander. These men rose because they were extraordinary at what they did, and because Genghis Khan was paying attention. This meritocratic principle extended into the administrative structure of the empire. The decimal system of military organization, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, was not organized along tribal lines. It deliberately broke up the old clan structures, mixing men of different origins into units whose loyalty was to the empire and to their commander rather than to their birth group. This was, in its way, an act of social engineering as radical as any in the medieval world. It destroyed the old tribalism at its roots by ensuring that the unit of loyalty was no longer the clan, but the army itself. Then there was the question of religion. Genghis Khan was personally a follower of Tengrism, the sky worship of the Mongolian steppe, the belief in Tengri, the eternal heaven, and in the spirits of earth and water and mountain that populated the world around him. He consulted shamans. He prayed on mountains. He believed, with apparent sincerity, that Tengri had chosen him for his mission, that his extraordinary rise from nothing to universal Khan was evidence of divine favor, of a mandate from heaven to rule the earth. But he did not impose this belief on anyone. The Yasa was explicit on the subject of religious practice. It was free. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, Jews, Nestorians, animists of every variety, all were permitted to worship as they chose within the empire. More than permitted, they were actively protected.
Clergy of all faiths were exempted from taxation. Religious institutions were shielded from military interference. Genghis Khan received representatives of every major faith with equal courtesy, listened to their explanations of their beliefs with what appears to have been genuine curiosity, and declined to be converted by any of them. His reasoning, as recorded by various observers, was pragmatic as much as philosophical. He did not know which religion was correct. Perhaps they all contained some portion of truth. What he did know was that forcing people to abandon their faith created resentment, and resentment created instability, and instability was the one thing an empire of this size and complexity absolutely could not afford. Better to let each people pray in their own way and save the empire's energy for the things that actually mattered. This tolerance was not, it should be said, unlimited. It did not extend to religious institutions that used their authority to challenge imperial power or to foment political resistance. Genghis Khan was entirely capable of destroying a religious community that crossed that line. But the line was political, not theological. Believe what you wish, just do not use what you believe to justify opposing the Khan. By the standards of the medieval world, an era of crusades and inquisitions and religiously motivated massacres, this was an extraordinary position. It made the Mongol Empire, in certain respects, one of the most religiously pluralistic societies on earth.
Alongside the Yasa, Genghis Khan created a series of practical systems for holding the empire together across its vast distances. A paisa was one of them. A paisa was a tablet made of gold, silver, or iron, depending on the rank it represented, that served as a kind of imperial passport and authorization document. A messenger or official carrying a gold paisa could demand horses, food, and shelter at any point in the empire. A merchant carrying a silver one could travel safely under imperial protection. These tablets were not merely symbols, they were keys to the empire's infrastructure, to the Yam system, the network of relay stations spaced at regular intervals across the entire length of Mongol-controlled territory, each one stocked with fresh horses and provisions, each one obligated by imperial decree to serve any traveler presenting the correct credentials. The Yam system was, in its way, the nervous system of the empire. It allowed information to travel at speeds that seemed almost impossible to the people of the settled world. A message could cross the entire breadth of the Mongol realm in days rather than weeks. Armies could be coordinated across distances that would have made coordination impossible for any previous military power. Genghis Khan could, in theory, know what was happening at the edge of his empire and respond to it with a speed that his enemies found disorienting and his administrators found indispensable. There was also the creation of a written script for the Mongolian language, adapted from the Uyghur script that the Naimans had used, imposed now as the administrative language of the empire. A man named Tatatungo, a Naiman official captured after the defeat of Tayang Khan, was tasked with teaching the new script to Genghis Khan's sons and to the officials who would need to read and write the decrees of the new order. The Mongols had been, until this point, a people without writing. Now they had it. And with writing came the possibility of a bureaucracy, of laws recorded rather than merely remembered, of decisions preserved rather than lost when the man who made them died. All of these systems, the Yasa, the decimal military organization, the religious tolerance, the paisa and Yam networks, the new script, were not the work of a single moment. They accumulated over years, developed and refined as the empire grew and its administrative challenges multiplied. But their foundations were laid in the years immediately after the Kurultai of 1206, when Genghis Khan understood that he had won the steppe and now needed to figure out how to keep it. He was not, as his enemies would later portray him, simply a destroyer. He was a builder, of a particular and ruthless kind, building with the materials that the world had given him, which were often harsh and sometimes terrible, but building nonetheless. The empire needed order before it could expand. It needed roots before it could reach.
By 1209, it had both. And Genghis Khan, having given his new nation its laws and its systems and its identity, turned his attention to the horizons that had always drawn him. To the south, behind their great walls, the kingdoms of China waited. He had unfinished business there.
There has never been anything quite like the Mongol army. Not before it, and not in the specific combination of qualities that made it what it was after it either. Armies have been larger. Armies have been more technologically sophisticated. Armies have fought with greater firepower, greater armor, greater logistical support. But the Mongol army of the 13th century possessed a particular constellation of attributes: speed, coordination, adaptability, psychological sophistication, and a quality of relentless operational pressure that simply did not let up, that made it, across the arc of its peak decades, effectively unbeatable in open warfare by anything the medieval world could put in the field against it. Understanding how it worked is essential to understanding what came next. The foundation was the decimal system. Every warrior in the Mongol army belonged to a unit of 10, an arban. 10 arbans formed a company of 100, a zun. 10 zuns formed a regiment of 1,000, a mingan. And 10 mingans formed a division of 10,000, a tumen. The entire army was built on this clean, recursive logic, and it accomplished something that previous steppe armies had never managed with consistency. It created a command structure that was simultaneously flexible and disciplined, capable of operating in small independent units or massing into overwhelming force as the situation demanded. The commanders of each level, the leaders of tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, were appointed by Genghis Khan personally or by commanders he trusted on the basis of demonstrated ability. They were responsible for the men beneath them in the most total sense. If a man in their unit failed, the commanders shared the consequence. If the unit performed brilliantly, the commander rose. The accountability ran in both directions, and it ran without exception. This system also, as we touched on in the previous chapter, deliberately dissolved the old tribal bonds. A man's arban might contain warriors from 3 or 4 different clans, none of whom had known each other before the empire. Their loyalty was to the unit, to the commander, and to the Khan, not to the tribe they had been born into. This was not an accident. It was a calculated dismantling of the primary source of instability that had plagued the steppe for centuries. You cannot defect to your tribe if your tribe is no longer the unit you fight with. The warriors themselves were, by any measure, extraordinary. Every Mongol soldier was, first and foremost, a horseman. He had been riding since childhood. He could sleep in the saddle. He could cover distances in a single day that would take a European knight several days to match, and do it on a diet that required almost no logistical support. Dried meat, fermented mare's milk called arag, blood drawn from a small cut in a living horse when nothing else was available. The Mongol warrior carried everything he needed on his horses, typically 3 to 5 remounts per man, allowing him to switch mounts continuously and maintain speed over long distances without exhausting any single animal. He carried a composite bow, the weapon we described earlier, capable of penetrating armor at 200 meters or more from a galloping horse. He carried a quiver of 60 arrows, typically a mix of types: light arrows for long-range harassment, heavier armor-piercing arrows for close engagement, and sometimes specialized arrows with whistling heads designed to signal or to terrify. He carried a short, curved sword for close combat, a lance, and often a lasso, an instrument of both herding and warfare, capable of pulling an armored knight from his horse with efficient brutality. He was not, by the standards of armored medieval warfare, heavily protected. Light leather armor, a helmet of leather or iron depending on rank and wealth, sometimes a silk undergarment. The latter not merely a luxury but a practical innovation, since an arrow that penetrated the silk rather than tearing it could often be removed by twisting the fabric around the arrowhead, reducing damage and enabling field medicine. The lack of heavy armor was not a weakness, it was the entire point. It meant he could move, and moving was what the Mongol army did better than anything else on Earth. Speed was not simply a tactical advantage, it was a strategic weapon.
The Mongol army moved, by the standards of its era, at almost incomprehensible velocity. A Tumen, 10,000 cavalry, could cover 60 to 80 miles in a single day across open terrain. A campaign that an enemy expected to develop over weeks would arrive in days. Cities that believed themselves safely distant from the advancing front would suddenly find Mongol scouts at their gates before their diplomatic messages requesting help had even reached their destination. This speed was enabled by the logistical system that underpinned the entire operation. The Mongol army did not drag a slow baggage train behind it in the manner of European armies, which often moved at the pace of their slowest ox cart. Instead, it moved with minimal supplies, living off the land and off the herds that accompanied it, resupplying through the Yam relay system when operating in Mongol-controlled territory and off plunder when operating in enemy territory. The entire logistical philosophy was built around the principle of maximum mobility. Never let supply chains slow the army down. The planning that preceded campaigns was meticulous and patient in ways that often surprised enemies who had mistaken Mongol ferocity for simple impulsiveness. Before a major campaign, Genghis Khan gathered intelligence. Merchants who had traveled through the target territory were interviewed. Diplomatic missions were sent, ostensibly for negotiation, but actually to observe roads, fortifications, garrison sizes, water sources, the mood of the population. Spies were deployed months or years in advance. The Mongols developed an intelligence network that was, for its time, without parallel. A web of information gathering that fed into campaign planning with a thoroughness that would not have been out of place in a modern military staff. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare was as carefully considered as the military one. Terror was a weapon, deployed with deliberate calculation. Before a major campaign, Genghis Khan would typically send an ultimatum to the target. Submit, and your people will be spared, your institutions respected, your lives continued under Mongol administration. Resist and face total destruction. This was not an empty threat. The examples of cities that had resisted and been annihilated, Zhongdu, Samarkand, Urgench, Merv, were real and documented and widely known. The policy was consistent enough that it became, in a very real sense, a rational calculation for city governors and kings. The cost of resistance, if resistance failed, was catastrophic. The cost of submission was an annual tribute and the maintenance of a Mongol administrator. The mathematics were not complicated. When a city did submit, Genghis Khan was, by the standards of the age, surprisingly moderate in his treatment of the population. Artisans and craftsmen were separated out and sent to Mongolia, or to other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. Administrators were often retained, religious figures were protected. Trade resumed. The city became part of the empire and continued to function, changed but not erased. When a city resisted, when it fought back, when it killed Mongol envoys, when it held out and forced a siege, the outcome was deliberately, theatrically different. The population was typically massacred or enslaved. The city was looted and often burned. The example was left visible for the next city to consider. This two-track policy, mercy for the compliant, annihilation for the defiant, was not simple cruelty. It was a rational system for minimizing the total cost of conquest. Each city that submitted without a fight was a city that did not require a siege, did not require weeks of Mongol casualties, did not require the expenditure of resources that could be spent on the next campaign. The terror was the mechanism by which submission was made to seem, to frightened governors and populations, like the more rational choice. The tactical brilliance of Mongol commanders in the field was the final element that made the machine complete. The feigned retreat was perhaps their most celebrated maneuver, and the one that the settled world's armies, despite knowing about it in advance, consistently fell for. A Mongol force would engage an enemy, then appear to break and flee in disorder. The enemy, seeing what looked like a rout, would pursue, breaking their own formation in the process, spreading out across the terrain in the chaos of what seemed like a pursuit turning into a victory. And then the fleeing Mongols would turn. From the flanks, other units that had been waiting at a distance would close in. The enemy, now scattered and disordered by their own enthusiasm, would find themselves enveloped, surrounded, and destroyed by an army that had never actually been retreating at all. The Mongols used fire signals, flag signals, and drums to coordinate across distances that made voice commands impossible. Their commanders understood the terrain they were fighting on. They had scouted it in advance, knew its features, had planned their maneuvers around its specific contours. They attacked from unexpected directions. They operated at night when enemy commanders expected rest. They exploited the freeze of rivers in winter to cross barriers that were supposed to protect cities. They adapted to new conditions with a flexibility that comes from an army that trusts its commanders at every level to make decisions without waiting for orders from above. It was, in every sense, a total military system. Weapon and mind and motion fused into a single instrument of conquest that the world had never encountered before and would spend decades trying to understand. By the time most of its enemies understood it, they had already lost.
The world beyond the steppe was not a single thing. It was a mosaic of civilizations, each with its own history and its own sense of permanence, each believing, in the way that all established powers believe, that the arrangements of the present would broadly resemble the arrangements of the future. To the south and east of the Mongolian plateau, two major powers dominated the landscape. The first was the Shisha, the Tangut Kingdom, a sophisticated Buddhist state that had carved out its territory in the arid lands of what is now northwestern China, straddling the ancient Silk Road routes with a population of several million and an army experienced enough to have held its own against its much larger neighbors for generations. The second was the Jin dynasty, the rulers of northern China, a Jurchen people who had themselves swept down from the north a century earlier, overthrown the previous dynasty, and established a state of enormous wealth and military power, governing tens of millions of people from their capital at Zhongdu, the city that would one day become Beijing. Both would fall to Genghis Khan. But not at once, and not easily. And in the falling, much would be revealed about how the Mongol Empire actually worked, how it learned, how it adapted, how it absorbed the tools and techniques of civilizations it was in the process of destroying and used them to destroy the next one. The Shisha came first. Genghis Khan launched his initial raids into Tangut territory in 1205, 3 years before the Great Kurultai that formally proclaimed him Khan of Khans. These early incursions were not yet full campaigns. They were probing operations, the military equivalent of reading the terrain. He wanted to understand the Tangut defenses, assess their military capacity, identify their weaknesses. What he found was instructive. The Shisha had cities, real cities with walls of packed earth and stone, with garrisons, with the accumulated infrastructure of a settled civilization. The Mongols, at this stage, had no experience with siege warfare. Their entire military tradition had been built around mobility, around the open steppe engagement, around the raid and the pursuit and the feigned retreat. Cities were a problem they had not yet solved. Genghis Khan noted this problem and kept moving. The raids of 1205 and 1207 were destructive and profitable. Mongol forces swept through Tangut borderlands, seized livestock and goods, tested response times, then withdrew before any serious counterforce could organize. Each raid was also a lesson. The Mongols observed how the Tangut defenders operated, what their cavalry could and could not do, how quickly their fortifications could be reinforced. Information was flowing back to the Khan. The full campaign came in 1209. This time, Genghis Khan brought the weight of a proper invasion, a force large enough not merely to raid, but to hold ground, besiege fortifications, and force a political decision. The Mongols swept into Tangut territory with a speed that overwhelmed the frontier defenses.
City after city was either captured or isolated, cut off from supply and communication, left to wither while the main Mongol force pressed deeper into the kingdom. The Tangut capital, Zhongxing, proved more difficult. It was a large and well-defended city, and the Mongols, still learning the art of siege, attempted an approach that was characteristically improvised and ambitious. They tried to divert the Yellow River to flood the city's defenses, an audacious plan that in the event worked better against the Mongols than against the Tanguts. The flooding became uncontrollable and threatened the Mongol camp itself, forcing a partial withdrawal.
But the campaign had achieved enough. The Tangut ruler, recognizing that his kingdom had been penetrated and his army outmaneuvered, came to terms. Si Shah submitted to Mongol overlordship, agreed to pay tribute, and promised military support for future campaigns. The form of the submission was significant. The Tanguts were not destroyed, not absorbed, not erased. They were made vassals. They became, in the structure of the growing empire, a subordinate state that continued to exist and function, but now existed in service to Mongol power. It was a template that Genghis Khan would use again and again. Submission accepted, rebellion punished, utility preserved. The Tangut experience also accelerated one of the most important transformations in Mongol military capacity. The problem of cities, of walls, of the settled world's habit of retreating behind stone and packed earth and waiting out an attacker. This problem was not going away. It would define the next phase of Mongol expansion, and Genghis Khan, confronting it with the same pragmatic intelligence he brought to every obstacle, began to solve it. He recruited engineers. Chinese engineers initially, men who understood the mechanics of siege machinery, who could build and operate trebuchets and mangonels and battering rams, who knew how to undermine walls and construct assault towers and manage the logistics of a siege in ways that the steppe tradition had never needed to develop. These men were absorbed into the Mongol military system not as prisoners, but as valued specialists, given the protection and status that the empire extended to anyone whose skills made it more powerful. They brought with them knowledge, and knowledge in the Mongol system was transferred and applied with remarkable speed. By the time Genghis Khan turned his full attention to the Jin dynasty, the Mongol army was no longer purely a cavalry force. It had acquired, through capture and recruitment and deliberate learning, the capacity to fight in the mode that the settled world required, besieging cities, conducting engineering operations, adapting its methods to terrain and fortification in ways that would have been simply impossible a decade earlier. The war against the Jin began in 1211. It was, from the outset, a war of enormous ambition and personal significance. The Jin dynasty was not a border raider or a regional vassal state. It was one of the great powers of the medieval world, governing northern China with an administrative apparatus of sophisticated complexity, commanding armies of hundreds of thousands, possessed of wealth that dwarfed anything the steppe had ever produced. To attack it was not merely audacious. By any conventional military calculus, it was absurd. Genghis Khan attacked it anyway. His justification, in the logic of his own worldview, was layered. The Jin had long treated the peoples of the steppe as subordinates, extracting tribute, playing tribes against each other to prevent any unified power from emerging, conducting punitive raids when steppe leaders became too powerful. They had, generations earlier, executed a Mongol ancestor of Genghis Khan in a particularly humiliating fashion. And they had, more recently, supported the Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father, in their conflicts with the Mongols. In the accounting that Genghis Khan kept of grievances and obligations, the Jin owed a debt. He came to collect it. The initial Mongol invasion crossed the Gobi Desert in a movement that the Jin commanders simply did not believe was possible. The desert was supposed to be a natural barrier, too vast, too waterless, too hostile to allow a large army to cross at its speed. The Mongols crossed it anyway, as they had learned to cross every obstacle the world placed in their path, by moving fast and carrying what they needed and not stopping for anything that was not absolutely necessary. The Jin army that met them was large and well-equipped, but it was structured for a different kind of war of fixed positions, fortified passes, defensive lines that assumed an enemy would come in a direction and at a pace that could be prepared for. The Mongols came in multiple directions simultaneously, moving faster than any coordinated response could match, striking at supply lines and communication networks, isolating fortifications rather than attacking them directly, keeping the Jin commanders perpetually off balance and reactive. The battles of the initial campaign were devastating for the Jin. At Yehuling in 1211, a mountain pass that the Jin had chosen as their defensive line, Mongol forces shattered the main Jin army in an engagement that left tens of thousands dead. The pass fell. The road into the heart of northern China opened. What followed over the next several years was not a single campaign, but a grinding, complex war of attrition, punctuated by moments of spectacular Mongol success and occasional Jin resistance that slowed but never stopped the overall advance. Genghis Khan understood that the Jin Empire was too large and too administratively deep to be destroyed in a single stroke. It had to be hollowed out. Its armies defeated in the field, its cities isolated, its countryside stripped of the agricultural production that fed its urban populations, its frontier defenses breached repeatedly until the psychological certainty of the Jin ruling class, that certainty that their walls and their administration and their military tradition would ultimately prevail, began to crack. He was patient in the way that only a man who has spent decades building toward a goal can be patient. He did not need to win everything at once. He needed to win consistently, to demonstrate that the cost of resistance was perpetual and cumulative, to make the Jin understand that there was no cavalry coming over the horizon to save them because there was no power on earth large enough to send it. The fall of Zhongdu came in 1215. It did not fall in a single dramatic assault. It fell after years of siege and encirclement, after supply lines had been cut and relief armies defeated, after the population had exhausted its food stores and its capacity to endure. When the city finally fell, when the Mongol forces entered through the gates of what had been the most magnificent city in northern China, the aftermath was terrible. Fire consumed much of it. The destruction was immense. But Genghis Khan was not present for the final fall of Zhongdu. He had already moved on. Leaving commanders and administrators behind to consolidate the Jin territories, he had turned his attention westward, toward a new horizon, a new power, a new set of grievances that would demand a reckoning of even greater violence and scale than anything that had come before. Word had reached him from the west. A caravan of Mongol merchants, men traveling under the protection of the imperial Paitsa, men who should have been untouchable by any ruler who understood the consequences of touching them, had been murdered. Their goods had been seized, their bodies had been left in the dust of a Central Asian city called Otrar. The man responsible was a governor named Inalchuk, operating under the authority of a vast and powerful Islamic empire called Khwarazm. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors. He sent a formal demand for justice, for the governor to be handed over, for the insult to be acknowledged, for the laws of commerce and diplomatic protection that he had established to be recognized even by powers that had not yet learned at sufficient cost what it meant to disregard them. The Shah of Khwarazm killed the ambassadors. He shaved the heads of the surviving members of the diplomatic party and sent them home as a message. It was the last message he would ever send to Genghis Khan. And the reply, when it came, would be written not in words, but in fire.
To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Khwarazm was. It was not a minor kingdom. It was not a regional power of modest ambition and limited reach. The Khwarazmian Empire, at the height of its power in the early 13th century, was one of the largest and most impressive states in the Islamic world. A sprawling dominion that stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the edges of the Caspian steppe in the north, from the borders of India in the east to the fringes of the Caucasus in the west. Its cities were among the most magnificent on earth. Samarkand and Bukhara were not merely trading posts, they were centers of Islamic civilization,
places of scholarship and architecture and commerce, where libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts, where astronomers mapped the heavens, where merchants from China and India and the Mediterranean world exchanged goods and ideas along the ancient routes of the Silk Road. The population of the Khwarazmian Empire numbered in the tens of millions. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, commanded an army of several 100,000 soldiers. When Genghis Khan looked west toward Khwarezm, he was not looking at a weakened or declining power. He was looking at something that, by any reasonable assessment, should have been capable of defending itself. The Shah did not think much of the Mongols. He had heard of them, of course. News traveled along the Silk Road in both directions, and the fall of Zhongdu had been noted with interest by the courts and merchants of Central Asia. But the Shah was a man of considerable confidence in his own power, and the Mongols were, in his estimation, a steppe people. Capable raiders, perhaps, not an existential threat to a civilized empire of his magnitude. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. But before the armies moved, there was the matter of Otrar. The city of Otrar sat on the Sir Darya River at the edge of Khwarezmian territory, a prosperous trading city that controlled one of the key entry points into Central Asia from the east. In 1218, a caravan of several hundred merchants traveling under Mongol imperial protection arrived at Otrar. They carried goods. They carried the paisa that should have guaranteed their safety. They were, in the accounting of Mongol imperial law, untouchable. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, who bore the honorific title Gair Khan, chose to see them differently. He accused them of being spies. He seized their goods, and he had them killed, every one of them. Whether they were spies is a question that historians have debated. It is entirely possible that some of the merchants were gathering intelligence. The Mongol system of commerce and espionage was well established by this point. But the accusation, even if true, did not justify the response under any law that the medieval world recognized. Merchants were sacred. Envoys were sacred. To kill them was not merely an insult, it was a declaration. Genghis Khan's response was measured at first. He sent a formal embassy to Shah Muhammad, 3 ambassadors, senior men, carrying a direct communication from the Khan. The message was explicit. Hand over Inalchuk, acknowledge the wrong, provide restitution.
The Shah's response has echoed through history as one of the most consequential acts of political miscalculation ever recorded. He had the senior ambassador killed. The other 2 he had shaved, a profound humiliation in the customs of the time, and sent back to Genghis Khan as a living message of contempt. It is said that when Genghis Khan received them, he climbed alone to a high place and prayed to Tengri for 3 days. Whether this was grief or rage finding its form in ritual, or the particular stillness of a man making a decision of absolute finality, we cannot know. What we know is what came after. He declared war. The campaign that followed, launched in the autumn of 1219 with a Mongol force estimated at somewhere between 100 and 200,000 warriors, was unlike anything Genghis Khan had yet undertaken. It was not a raid. It was not a punitive expedition with limited objectives. It was the systematic, total destruction of an empire. The genius of the campaign lay in its structure. Where previous conquerors had advanced on a broad front or concentrated force along a single axis of attack, Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple columns and sent them in different directions simultaneously, a strategic envelopment on a scale the world had never seen. The Shah, accustomed to warfare in which an enemy announced his axis of advance and could be met and defeated at a chosen defensive point, found himself facing a threat that seemed to materialize from every direction at once. The first column, under Genghis Khan's sons Jochi and Chagatai, moved to besiege Otrar, the city where the massacre had occurred, where Inalchuk waited behind walls that he must have known would not save him. The siege lasted 5 months. When the city finally fell,
Inalchuk retreated to the citadel and continued to fight even after all hope of relief was gone, hurling roof tiles at the attackers when his arrows ran out. He was captured alive. Molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a death that the Mongols considered both poetically appropriate and symbolically powerful. He had valued gold and silver above the lives of the merchants he had murdered. Now they were the instrument of his end. But while Otrar was still under siege, Genghis Khan himself had already moved west with frightening speed. He struck at Bukhara first. Bukhara was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a city of 500,000 people, of magnificent mosques and madrasas, of a scholarly tradition stretching back centuries. Its garrison fled before the Mongol advance could even fully materialize, calculating, perhaps correctly, that the walls could not hold and that flight offered more hope than siege. The city's population, left without defenders, opened its gates. The response to submission should have been moderation, and in some respects it was. The population was not massacred, but the city was stripped. The Great Friday Mosque was used as a stable. The treasuries were emptied. Genghis Khan rode into the city and addressed the assembled population from the pulpit of the mosque, an act of deliberate symbolic theater, telling them that their sins had brought this upon them, that he was the punishment of God, and that those who resisted would discover what that meant in full. The city was then burned, not entirely. Some structures survived, some neighborhoods endured, but the Bukhara that emerged from the Mongol passage was a shadow of what it had been. The libraries, the accumulated manuscripts, the physical repositories of centuries of Islamic scholarship, much of it was gone. Then came Samarkand. Samarkand was the Shah's showcase city, one of the most beautiful and populous in all of Central Asia, a city of perhaps 500,000 souls, defended by a large garrison and walls that had stood for centuries. Its fall might have been expected to take months. It took days.
Part of this was the collapse of the Khwarazmian military morale. The Shah had made a strategic decision that would prove fatal. Rather than concentrating his enormous army for a decisive engagement, he had dispersed his forces in garrisons across his empire, attempting to defend everywhere and therefore defending nowhere effectively. Each isolated garrison faced a portion of the Mongol force that was overwhelming in local terms, without any hope of reinforcement. One by one, they were defeated or they surrendered. In Samarkand, the garrison was large enough to have fought. Instead, after only a few days of Mongol pressure, the city's leaders opened the gates. They had calculated, as so many had calculated before them, that submission offered better odds than resistance. For the population, this calculation proved roughly correct. Most of the people survived, but the garrison soldiers who had surrendered were executed. Those who could be useful, the craftsmen, the scholars, the physicians, the engineers, were separated out and sent east. The rest experienced the Mongol passage in its full weight. The Shah himself fled. Muhammad II spent the last months of his life as a fugitive in his own empire, moving from city to city, from province to province, always one step ahead of the Mongol columns that Genghis Khan had sent specifically to hunt him. Jebe and Subutai, two of the greatest commanders in Mongol history, led this pursuit with a relentlessness that covered thousands of miles and served a dual purpose. They were trying to catch the Shah. They were also, in the course of the pursuit, conducting a reconnaissance of the lands to the west, Persia, the Caucasus, the edges of Russia, that would inform Mongol strategy for decades to come. The Shah never stopped running. He died on a small island in the Caspian Sea in 1220 of illness and despair, without an army and without a kingdom. He had gone from being the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world to a man hiding on a desolate island in the span of less than 2 years. The city of Urgench, meanwhile, was enduring the most terrible fate in the entire campaign. Urgench was the Khwarazmian capital, a great city on the Amu Darya River, one of the largest and most prosperous in Central Asia. Unlike Samarkand and Bukhara, Urgench chose to fight.
Its population resisted with a ferocity that surprised even the Mongols, turning every street and every building into a defensive position, forcing the attackers into brutal urban combat that cost both sides enormous casualties over weeks of grinding battle. When Urgench finally fell, and it did finally fall as everything fell, the retribution was total. The Mongols diverted the Amudarya River to flood the city, destroying what remained of its structures. The population, in the accounts of witnesses and later historians, was massacred on a scale that has made Urgench one of the defining symbols of Mongol destruction. The city that had been one of the great urban centers of the medieval world ceased, in any meaningful sense, to exist. The same fate visited Merv, Nishapur, Herat, city after city across the breadth of the Khwarazmian Empire, each one that had chosen resistance receiving the full weight of Mongol retribution, each one serving as a lesson for the cities that came after. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing a generation later, described landscapes of bones stretching for miles around the ruins of cities that had once held hundreds of thousands of people. Modern historians debate the precise numbers. The medieval sources are prone to exaggeration, and population estimates are difficult to verify across centuries. But there is no serious scholarly doubt that the Khwarazmian campaign produced human destruction on a scale that was, by the standards of any era, staggering. And yet, and this is the complication that the history of Genghis Khan always forces us to sit with, even in the midst of this destruction, the Mongol system was operating with its characteristic dual logic. Craftsmen were not killed. They were sent to Mongolia and to other parts of the empire, where their skills enriched the culture of their captors. Scholars who survived were sometimes protected. The Silk Road, which had been disrupted by the campaign, would, within a generation, be more secure and more active under Mongol administration than it had been under the Shah. The very infrastructure of trade and communication that the conquest had shattered would be rebuilt more efficiently under the Pax Mongolica that Genghis Khan's successors would establish.
This does not redeem the destruction. Nothing redeems the destruction. But it complicates the simple narrative of mindless barbarism, which is, in the end, too simple to be true of a man who was never, in any dimension of his life, simple. By 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity. The Shah was dead. His son Jalal ad-Din fought on for years with extraordinary bravery and skill, winning a notable battle against the Mongols at the Indus River, one of the very few defeats Genghis Khan suffered in this period, before eventually being hunted down and killed years later. But the empire itself was gone. Genghis Khan stood at the edge of the known world's western reaches and looked at what he had accomplished. In less than 3 years, he had destroyed one of the greatest empires on earth. He was, by this point, somewhere in his late 50s. He had been at war almost continuously for the better part of 4 decades. His body carried the accumulated damage of a lifetime on horseback, in battle, in the brutal climate of the steppe and the deserts and the mountain passes of Central Asia. He had sons who were themselves powerful men with their own ambitions and their own armies. He had an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. And he was not done. He turned his horse east. There was still unfinished business on the steppe. The Tenguts, the Shah, his oldest vassals, had refused to send troops for the Khwarazmian campaign. In the accounting that Genghis Khan kept, with its unfailing precision of obligations met and obligations refused, this was a debt that had been noted. It would be settled.
We have been following a conqueror. We have watched him move across the map of the medieval world like a force of nature, destroying cities, toppling dynasties, remaking the political geography of an entire continent with a consistency and scale that still staggers the imagination 8 centuries later. It is easy, in the face of that scale, to lose the man inside the myth, to let the enormity of what he did obscure the particular, human, contradictory person who did it. So let us pause here, in the space between campaigns, and try to look at him directly.
who was Genghis Khan when the armies were not moving? The physical descriptions we have are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, filtered through the perspectives of people who either feared him or revered him, or both simultaneously. He was tall by the accounts of those who saw him, tall and strongly built, with a broad forehead and, in some accounts, eyes that were described as greenish or hazel rather than the dark brown expected of a Mongolian man of his era. His hair in later life was long and worn in braids or tails in the manner of the steppe warrior. He carried himself, those who met him noted, with a quality of absolute stillness. Not the stillness of a man who is quiet or passive, but the stillness of a man in whom enormous energy was always present and always controlled. He was not, by the accounts that survive, a man of elaborate ceremony or personal vanity. He ate the food of the steppe, meat and mare's milk, the diet of his childhood, maintained through decades of campaign even when the wealth of conquered civilizations made almost anything available to him. He wore simple clothing by the standards of the rulers he had defeated. He drank arog, the fermented mare's milk of the Mongols, and occasionally wine captured from settled civilizations, but accounts suggest he was aware of the dangers of excess and counseled his sons against it, not always successfully. He slept in a ger. Even at the height of his power, even when the wealth of China and Persia flowed through his empire, the round felt tent of the nomad remained his home. It was not affectation, it was identity. The ger was what he was, the physical expression of a way of life that had made him and that he never, in any fundamental sense, left behind. He had a quality that his contemporaries and his generals described repeatedly in terms that varied by language and culture but converged on the same essential observation. He remembered everything. Names, faces, acts of loyalty performed years or decades earlier, grievances accumulated and filed with the same precision. Sorkin Shira, the man who had hidden him in a cart of wool when he escaped the Taichiutes as a boy. He was found decades later, after the unification of the steppe, and rewarded. The families of men who had shown him kindness in the years of his poverty were elevated. The families of men who had betrayed him were not forgotten either, though the reckoning sometimes came slowly. This memory was not merely personal, it was political. In a world without sophisticated record-keeping, where the empire was still developing its written administrative systems, the Khan's personal memory served as a living archive of obligations and debts, a human ledger of the relationships that held the empire together. He was, by all accounts, a man who inspired genuine devotion in those close to him, not just fear, not just calculated loyalty, but the particular devotion that comes when people feel genuinely seen and valued by someone of enormous power. His generals followed him across the world not merely because they had to, but because they wanted to. His personal guard, the Keshig, an elite force of 10,000 warriors who served as both bodyguard and administrative corps, were among the most intensely loyal soldiers in history. He had built that loyalty the same way he had built everything else, by demonstrating, consistently and without exception, that he valued it and rewarded it.
Now, his family. Borte remained his principal wife throughout his life, the first wife, the senior wife, the one whose sons held the highest claim to succession. She had given him 4 sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Toloi, the 4 who would, between them, inherit and eventually divide the empire. Each was a formidable figure in his own right, each with his own personality and his own political base within the Mongol system. Jochi, the eldest, carried through his entire life the shadow of the question his birth had raised, the question of his paternity that the months of Borte's captivity among the Merkits had made permanently unanswerable. He and his father had a relationship that was never entirely easy, layered with unspoken tension that occasionally broke the surface in painful ways. Jochi died in 1227, only months before his father. Whether from illness or from something more deliberate has never been established with certainty.
Chagatai was fierce and traditional, a man of strong opinions and inflexible loyalties who would become the most vocal opponent of his half-brother Jochi's claims. He and Jochi despised each other with a passion that sometimes threatened the unity of the entire imperial family. Ogedei was, of all the sons, perhaps the most politically gifted in the particular way that his father's empire required. Warm, sociable, capable of holding competing factions together through the force of his personality, he was also a prodigious drinker, a weakness that would eventually kill him. He was the son Genghis Khan chose as his successor, precisely because his temperament made him the one most likely to hold what his father had built. Toloi, the youngest, was the most militarily gifted of the four, his father's son in the most direct sense, a battlefield commander of ferocious ability who would play a central role in the final campaigns against the Jin dynasty after Genghis Khan's death. Beyond Borte, Genghis Khan had many other wives and consorts. The precise number is not recorded, but it was large, as was customary for a ruler of his power and as was demanded by the political logic of the steppe, where marriage was the primary mechanism of alliance building. Each new kingdom subdued, each new people absorbed, brought with it women of the ruling class who became part of the Khan's household. Their children were legitimate members of the imperial family, though ranked below Borte's sons in the hierarchy of succession. The genetic consequence of this, the sheer number of children Genghis Khan fathered, has become one of the most discussed statistical footnotes in modern genetics. Studies of Y chromosome lineages across Central Asia have found a genetic signature present in roughly 16 million men alive today that appears to originate from a single individual living in Mongolia around the 12th or 13th century. The mathematics of how this is possible, how one man's genetic legacy could expand to that scale in the time available, point directly to the particular circumstances of Genghis Khan's life and power. His sons and grandsons, themselves rulers of vast territories, continued the pattern. The Mongol imperial family, across 3 generations, fathered children with an efficiency that no other lineage in recorded history appears to match. Now let us speak of his faith.
Genghis Khan's relationship with the spiritual world was genuine, personal, and resistant to easy categorization. He was a Tengrist, a follower of the ancient sky religion of the Mongolian steppe, with its belief in the supreme god Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, and in the spirits that inhabited the natural world in all its forms. He prayed on mountains as his tradition dictated, climbing to high places to be closer to the sky, to speak to Tengri in the open air without walls or intermediaries. He believed, with what seems to have been complete sincerity, that Tengri had chosen him. The evidence of his own life supported this belief with a persuasiveness that is hard to dismiss. He had survived abandonment and slavery and battle and betrayal in circumstances that should, statistically, have killed him many times over. He had risen from absolutely nothing to the command of the largest empire on earth. If that was not the will of heaven, what was it? And yet his relationship with other religions was something more nuanced than simple dismissal. He received Christian priests and Muslim imams and Buddhist monks and Taoist scholars with genuine curiosity and apparent open-mindedness. He asked them questions. He listened to their answers. He exempted their clergy from taxation. He protected their places of worship. There is a famous account of a long conversation between Genghis Khan and the Taoist monk Qiu Chuji, who traveled from China to meet him in Central Asia, a journey of thousands of miles that the old monk made at the Khan's invitation. They spoke of life and death and the nature, the cosmos, and Genghis Khan listened with what Qiu Chuji described as genuine attentiveness. He asked Qiu Chuji if he knew the secret of immortality. The monk said that he knew how to preserve life, but not how to make it infinite. Genghis Khan accepted this answer with equanimity. He was not, it seems, a man who clung to the fantasy of escaping the human condition. He lived with the knowledge of his own mortality in the straightforward way of a man who had spent a lifetime surrounded by death and had made his peace with it, not through theology,
but through action. He had done what he had come to do. Whatever came after was in Tengri's hands. This is perhaps the deepest contradiction in the man. He was capable of ordering the destruction of entire cities, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, with what appears to have been strategic rather than emotional decision-making. And he was also capable of the long conversation with an old monk about the nature of existence, of the tender reunion with Borte in the chaos of a raid, of the precise and loyal memory that elevated Sorkhan Shira after 30 years because he had once hidden a boy in a cart of wool and looked the other way. He was not a simple monster. He was not a romantic hero. He was something that history produces only rarely and that the world is never quite prepared for. A man of enormous ability operating in circumstances of enormous consequence, whose actions contained both the best and worst that human beings are capable of, sometimes in the same moment. We will not resolve that contradiction tonight. Perhaps it cannot be resolved. Perhaps the most honest thing we can do is hold it, sit with the fullness of it, the darkness and the complexity together, and let the weight of it teach us something about the world that made him and the world he made in return.
He was old now, or something close to it. In a world where most men were considered elderly at 50, where the accumulated damage of a life lived hard showed early and aged fast, Genghis Khan was somewhere in his early 60s, ancient by the standards of the steppe, and carrying in his body the evidence of every decade he had survived. The falls from horses, the wounds of battle, the endless campaigns across deserts and mountains and frozen steppe, through heat that cracked the skin and cold that split the earth. He had been in almost continuous motion for 40 years, and motion at that pace, over that duration, leaves marks that do not heal. And yet, he was not done. The Tanguts had defied him. This, in the moral accounting of Genghis Khan, was not a matter that time would soften or distance would resolve. The Shah, his oldest vassals, the first people to submit to his authority, the kingdom whose defeat had been the opening lesson in how to fight the settled world, had refused to contribute troops to the Khwarazmian campaign. Their ruler had reportedly sent a message of extraordinary arrogance, telling the Khan that if he did not have enough soldiers to fight his wars, he should not start them. The words, if they were truly spoken in that form, were a kind of death warrant. In the years immediately after the Khwarazmian campaign, Genghis Khan had been occupied with other matters: the consolidation of conquered territories, the administrative challenges of governing an empire of unprecedented scale, the management of his sons and their increasingly complicated rivalries, and a major campaign in the east against the Jin dynasty that required his personal attention. But the Tangut insult had not been forgotten. It had been filed away with the same quiet precision that governed all of his long memories, waiting for the moment when it could be addressed. That moment came in 1226. The campaign Genghis Khan launched against the Shah in that year was, from the beginning, different in character from the earlier Tangut wars. Those had been wars of conquest and submission, wars designed to bring the Tanguts into the Mongol system as functional vassals, preserved and exploited rather than destroyed. This campaign had a different quality. It was punitive in the most total sense. It was designed to produce a usable vassal state. It was designed to produce an example. He crossed back into Tangut territory in the winter of 1225 to 1226, leading the army himself, despite the protestations, it is said, of those around him who worried about his health and his age. He was the Khan. He did not send others to settle the debts that were owed to him personally. The campaign opened in winter, deliberately so. The Mongols had long understood that their enemies expected campaigns to slow or stop in cold weather,
that the settled world organized its defenses around the assumption of seasonal warfare. By attacking in winter, Genghis Khan shattered that assumption, catching Tangut forces unprepared and moving through terrain that his cavalry, with their hardy steppe horses, could navigate where other armies could not. City after city fell. The Tangut armies that came out to meet the Mongols in the field were destroyed with an efficiency that reflected the full maturity of the military machine Genghis Khan had spent decades building. The campaign rolled through the Shisha heartland with a momentum that never fully paused, never gave the defenders the breathing room they needed to regroup and plan a coherent response.
But then, during the campaign's early months, something happened. The accounts vary in their details, as the accounts of this period often do, filtered through sources written years or decades after the events they describe, shaped by the perspectives of cultures that had their own reasons to emphasize certain aspects of the story over others. What is agreed upon is this: Genghis Khan was injured. Some accounts say he was thrown from his horse during a hunt, a Mongolian royal hunt, the great organized drives in which thousands of warriors formed a vast circle and drove game inward for days until the Khan made the first kills, a ritual that was simultaneously sport and military exercise and demonstration of imperial power. A fall from a horse at 60-something years old, after a lifetime of riding, is not a minor thing. The bones do not absorb impact the way they once did. The injuries do not heal at the pace they once healed. Other accounts speak of illness rather than injury, a fever perhaps, the kind of infection that campaigns in unfamiliar territory made common, against which a body already worn by decades of war had diminishing resistance. Whatever the precise cause, Genghis Khan was not well. Those around him knew it, his commanders knew it, and by certain accounts he himself knew it, with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a man who had spent his life reading the landscape around him and who now read his own body with the same unflinching honesty. There are accounts, their authenticity debated, their emotional power undeniable, of him calling his sons to his side during this period and speaking to them of what would come after. He told them, or is said to have told them, that the conquest of the Jin dynasty was not yet complete and that it would require coordination among them all. He spoke of the importance of unity, of the catastrophic consequences for the empire and for the family of allowing rivalry to fracture what had been built. He knew his sons. He knew their natures. He knew that Chagatai and Jochi already hated each other with a passion that his own presence barely contained. He confirmed Ogedei as his successor and asked his sons to honor that choice. Whether these words were spoken in precisely the form the sources record them, or whether they represent the retrospective wisdom that later chroniclers placed in the mouth of a dying man, the substance of them reflects something real about the moment. An empire of this size, built by the force of one person's extraordinary will and ability, faces an existential question at the moment of that person's death. Who holds it together? What keeps the sons from tearing it apart? The campaign against Shisha continued even as the Khan's health declined. There's something almost mythic in this, the old warrior weakening, refusing to stop. The cities of the Tangut kingdom fell one by one. The capital, Zhongsing, was besieged. The Tangut ruler, seeing the inevitable approaching with the slow, terrible clarity of a man who had run out of options, attempted to negotiate a surrender. Genghis Khan accepted it, but he did not live to receive it in person. In the summer of 1227, somewhere in the fields during the final stages of the Shisha campaign, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause of his death has never been established with certainty. The sources offer several possibilities, none of them definitively confirmed. The injuries from the hunting fall or the illness contracted during the campaign, or some combination of both, a body already weakened that could not recover from one more assault. Some later sources, primarily from non-Mongol traditions, proposed more dramatic causes, an arrow wound, a poisoning, even a story involving a captured Tangut princess. But these accounts carry little historical weight and read more as the kind of mythology that gathers around the deaths of great figures than as reliable testimony.
The most likely truth is more ordinary and more human than legend demands. He was old, he was tired, he was ill, and the body that had carried him through 6 decades of extraordinary life could not carry him any further. The manner in which his death was handled tells us something important about the world he had built. His commanders and the members of his inner circle made an immediate decision. The death would not be announced. Not yet. Not while the campaign was still active. Not while the negotiation with the Tangut ruler was still in progress. The army continued to operate as though the Khan were alive. Orders were issued in his name. The siege continued. When the Tangut ruler came out to offer his formal surrender, he was killed. By whose order and under what precise justification the sources debate, but the result was that the last ruler of Shah died in the aftermath of Genghis Khan's own death. The debt settled even as the man who had demanded payment left the world. The body was taken back to Mongolia for burial. The funeral cortege moved slowly, in secret, across the vast distances of the steppe. Those who encountered it along the route and might carry news of what had happened were, by various accounts, killed, an extreme measure, but one that reflects the absolute priority placed on controlling the information of the Khan's death until the succession could be managed and the empire stabilized. He was buried, as he had directed, in a secret location. The site has never been found. This was deliberate. Genghis Khan had expressed, in the years before his death, a wish for a burial without monument, without the grand architectural statements of permanence that the settled civilizations built around their dead rulers. He was a man of the steppe. The steppe did not build monuments. It absorbed everything back into the grass and the wind and the open sky eventually, and he seems to have accepted this, even embraced it as the appropriate end for a man who had spent his life in motion. The horses that passed over his gravesite are said to have obscured every trace of disturbed earth. Trees were planted. The land was left to return to itself. Within a generation, the precise location was known to almost no one. The greatest conqueror in history lies somewhere beneath the Mongolian steppe, unmarked and unfound, as anonymous in death as he had been in the first years of his life. The fatherless boy on the banks of the Onon, with nothing and no one, and the whole enormous world pressing down on him. He had answered that pressure in the only way he knew, with everything he had.
When Genghis Khan died in the summer of 1227, the empire he left behind was already the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, and it was not finished growing. That is perhaps the most astonishing thing about the legacy of a man who lived to somewhere in his early 60s and spent the last decades of his life in almost continuous campaign. The empire he built did not stop at his death. It accelerated. His sons and grandsons took the foundations he had laid, the military system, the administrative infrastructure, the Yasa, the culture of merit and loyalty, the sheer momentum of Mongol expansion, and extended them across distances and into civilizations that even Genghis Khan himself had never reached. Under his son Ogedei, who took the title of Great Khan in 1229 and ruled until his death in 1241, the Mongol Empire pushed westward into Russia and Eastern Europe with a ferocity that sent shockwaves through every court from Poland to France. The armies of Subutai and Batu Khan destroyed city after city across the Russian principalities, Kiev, Vladimir, Ryazan, and then crossed into Poland and Hungary, annihilating European armies at the Battle of Legnica and the Battle of Mohi in the spring of 1241. They stood at the edge of the Adriatic Sea. Western Europe, watching in stunned horror, had no realistic defense prepared and no coalition capable of stopping what was coming. And then Ogedei died in December of 1241, and the Mongol armies turned back east for the Kurultai that would determine the succession. Europe never knew how close it had come. Under Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, the empire reached its greatest extent and its most sophisticated administrative form.
Kublai conquered the southern Song dynasty, completing the subjugation of China that his grandfather had begun, and established the Yuan dynasty, ruling as a Chinese emperor while remaining in his own identity a Mongol Khan. He built a capital at what is now Beijing. He received Marco Polo at his court. He presided over a civilization that was, in its particular moment, the most cosmopolitan on Earth, a meeting place of Chinese, Persian, Turkish, Mongolian, and European cultures, where goods and ideas and people moved with a freedom of circulation that the fragmented world before the Mongol conquests had never quite managed. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The phrase requires careful handling. It is not and cannot be a celebration of conquest and the devastation that preceded it. The peace was purchased at an almost incomprehensible price in human life and cultural destruction. The cities that had been reduced to rubble, the populations that had been massacred or enslaved, the libraries and irrigation systems and accumulated knowledge of centuries that had been destroyed in the process of creating this unified space, these are not footnotes. They are the foundation on which the peace was built, and the weight of that foundation must always be acknowledged. But the Pax Mongolica was real, and its effects on the connected world were profound and lasting. For roughly a century, from approximately the 1250s to the 1350s, the Mongol Empire maintained a system of security and communication across the breadth of Eurasia that had no precedent and would have no successor until the modern era. The Silk Road, those ancient routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, along which silk and spices and paper and ideas had traveled for centuries in fits and starts, interrupted by political fragmentation and regional warfare, became, under Mongol administration, more reliable and more active than it had ever been before. A merchant or diplomat or traveler who set out from Venice or Genoa could, in this period, travel overland through the entire breadth of Asia to China with a reasonable expectation of safety. Not certainty, but reasonable expectation. The Yam relay stations provided fresh horses and food at regular intervals. The Paisa system guaranteed the protection of the imperial authority to those who carried it. The empire's policy of religious tolerance meant that a Christian traveling through Muslim Central Asia or a Muslim traveling through Buddhist territories faced no systematic persecution on account of their faith.
The flow of goods along these routes transformed the economies of every region they touched. Chinese porcelain reached Europe in quantities that had previously been impossible. Persian carpet weaving techniques spread eastward. Indian spices moved west more efficiently than before. The silver of Europe found its way into the treasuries of China. Technologies that had existed in one part of the world for centuries began, in this period, their slow migration toward the other end of the continent. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass. Ideas and inventions whose origins lay in China began their long journey westward along the routes that Mongol security had made passable. There is a genuine historical debate about how much of this transfer was directly caused by the Pax Mongolica and how much would have happened anyway through the gradual permeation of trade networks. But the timing is suggestive. The century of Mongol peace corresponds with a period of remarkable acceleration in the exchange of knowledge and technology between East and West, an acceleration whose consequences would eventually include the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the transformation of European warfare by gunpowder. The empire that Genghis Khan built was also, in the end, too large and too diverse to hold together indefinitely as a single political unit. By the second half of the 13th century, the fractures that he had warned his sons about were becoming structural realities. The empire split into four major successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe. These successor states were not immediately enemies. The family connection and the shared Mongol identity created a degree of coordination that persisted for decades, but they were increasingly autonomous.
increasingly shaped by the cultures they ruled rather than the culture they had come from, and increasingly prone to the internal rivalries that Genghis Khan had always known were the empire's greatest vulnerability. The Ilkhanate rulers converted to Islam. The Yuan dynasty adopted Chinese administrative forms so completely that they became, in many respects, a Chinese dynasty that happened to have Mongol rulers. The Golden Horde became deeply integrated with the Turkic steppe cultures of the West. Each successor state was, in its way, a testament to the Mongol Empire's most remarkable and underappreciated quality, its capacity for absorption. The Mongols conquered cultures and were, in the end, absorbed by them. The conquerors became Chinese, became Persian, became Muslim, became part of the fabric of the civilizations they had once destroyed. This, too, is part of the legacy of Genghis Khan, though he could not have predicted its precise form. He had built an empire that was, by design, non-ideological. It had no religion to impose, no ethnic identity to demand, no cultural uniformity to enforce beyond the basic requirements of loyalty and administrative compliance. This openness, which had been a practical necessity in the process of conquest, became in the successor states a cultural permeability that allowed Mongol rule to dissolve, eventually, into the societies it governed, rather than remaining permanently alien and therefore permanently unstable. The Black Death, which swept across Eurasia in the mid-14th century and killed perhaps a third of the population of Europe and enormous numbers across Asia and the Middle East, traveled in part along the same routes that the Mongol peace had opened. The connected world that Mongol expansion had created was a world in which disease, as well as goods and ideas, could move with unprecedented speed and reach. The plague that devastated Europe in the 1340s and 1350s may have originated in Central Asia and reached the Mediterranean through the Black Sea trading networks that Mongol security had made so active. This, too, is part of the legacy, the darker, unintended consequence of the connectivity that the empire created. By the mid-14th century, the great Mongol Empire was fragmenting into its constituent parts, each piece following its own trajectory into the future. The Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown by the Ming in 1368. The Ilkhanate had already dissolved. The Golden Horde would persist in various forms until the 15th century and beyond, its successor states shaping the political landscape of Russia and Central Asia for generations.
But the memory of the empire, the idea of it, the scale of it, the particular achievement it represented, did not dissolve with its political structures. It echoed forward through centuries of history, shaping the ambitions and the strategies of every ruler who came after and dreamed of something comparable. Tamerlane, in the 14th century, constructed his conquests explicitly in the shadow of Mongol precedent, claiming Mongol legitimacy through marriage and political mythology. The Mughal emperors of India, whose very name derives from the Persian word for Mongol, traced their ancestry back to Genghis Khan's line and used that ancestry as a source of imperial legitimacy for generations. The Ottoman sultans and the Safavid Shahs both operated in political landscapes shaped in their deepest structures by what the Mongol conquests had done to the world. And then there is Mongolia itself. Today, Genghis Khan is not primarily a figure of fear or of historical ambivalence in the country of his birth. He is the founding father. His face is on the currency. The largest statue, equestrian statue in the world, a towering figure of stainless steel on horseback, facing east across the steppe from a hilltop an hour's drive from Ulaanbaatar, commemorates him as the father of the Mongolian nation, the man who took a fractured, anonymous, forgotten people and gave them an identity that the world could not ignore. That identity came at an enormous cost to others. The cities that were destroyed, the populations that were killed, the civilizations that were permanently damaged or erased by the passage of the Mongol armies, these are real, and the people who descended from those civilizations carry that history in ways that are not simply historical, they are personal. They are grief that has no grave to stand beside because the graves are too many and too old to visit individually. And yet,
The boy who was born clutching a blood clot on the banks of the Onon River, who was abandoned by his clan and enslaved by his enemies, and who built from literally nothing a political and military achievement that no one before or since has replicated, that story does not disappear into the violence it produced. It exists alongside the violence, inseparable from it, as the violence is inseparable from it. Genghis Khan is the most consequential individual of the second millennium. Not the most admirable, not the most virtuous, but the most consequential. The persons whose actions, more than any other single individual of that 1,000-year span, altered the trajectory of human history in ways that are still reverberating in the structure of the world we inhabit. He emerged from the grass. He changed everything, and the grass closed over him, and he was gone.